Hey everybody, thank you for joining in today to Ask the Experts from Prehab New York City. We want to thank Prehab San Diego as well for being in attendance. Hi Bree, behind the camera, and Marielle and everybody over at Prehab San Diego. Thank you for everybody who's joining in and everybody who's listening to the recording. For today's topic, we're going through the common biomechanical errors in runners, and the two topics that we want to hone into, me and Steven, are overstriding and heel striking. Over at Prehab, we have a big emphasis on working with running athletes, specifically in the elite population of marathon runners, long distance runners, and a lot of the times these athletes always express difficulty with certain movements in their bodies and different pains, aches, and whatnot. So hopefully this presentation that me and Steve will go through will get answer a lot of the questions and go through all the different nitty-gritty things that you need to know as a runner. Any point during this meeting, feel free to interrupt, simply just unmuting yourself or just leaving a comment in there, and Julie will let me know if I missed that comment, and I'll be able to answer that along with Steve. And then at the end, there'll be time for questions and concerns or anything else like that. So I'm going to share the screen now for the presentation. Okay. So for the topic of discussion today, like I said, it's common biomechanical errors in runners. Overstriding and heel striking are the two topics that we want to hone in on. So as for introductions myself, my name is Justinian. I'm a student clinician over here at Prehab as well as an athletic trainer. As you can see in these pictures, I love playing sports. I played college soccer for 4 years. I ski, play a lot of golf, play a lot of disc golf. I act like I run here in the Burke Rehabilitation for Rehab 5K, which is a good time that me and Steve ran together. So I like to immerse myself in a lot of athletics in order to stay in shape and just know how to work my body and correct movement patterns, which I like to work with my clients a lot with. In the bottom left picture, you can see me working for New York City Football Club. I worked for them for 2 years, working primarily with their academy as their athletic trainer on the sidelines. So we'll move on to the next.
So we're just going to quickly get into some definitions and then get into the fun stuff. So we're going to start by talking about biomechanics. Biomechanics is, as the definition says, the study of structure, function, and motion of the mechanical aspects of the biological system. So basically how your body moves. And then it also relates to kinematics, which is just how your body moves in space. Wait, hold on. I gotta go down this way. So there's a lot of words on the screen, and I don't want you guys to focus that much on it, but this is the basic biomechanics of running. It's very, very simplified. If anyone's seen the analysis that we do at Prehab, which we'll get into a little bit later, it is a lot more complicated than this. So it just breaks down the gait cycle into the stance phase, which is basically from when your heel touches the ground to when your toe comes off the ground. The float is when you're in the air, and swing is the legs moving. All of these are definitions that we won't get too far into, but we're mainly going to focus on the foot strike patterns, a little bit on force and velocity, ground reaction, and everyone knows what gravity is. So ground reaction is basically you're acting against the ground. It's the ground that forces back. Everything that happens has an equal and opposite reaction. So, I think Justinian had a few more words to say on this slide, and then he was going to take the next one, and then I'll follow up after that.
Yeah, so like Steve was talking about, a lot of words here, but when it comes to these words, really essentially it's just talking about the different motions and movements that are going through during this gait cycle, gait meaning walking and running. During the stance phase, you'll see the majority of our time is spent in that stance phase. Like Steve said, when your heel touches the ground, when your foot flattens on the ground, and then when your toe is the only aspect on the ground and that heel comes up. So essentially all the time it's on the ground. Then there'll be the float phase when you're up in the air. You can see here in the middle right there. And then the swing phase when that right leg, that blue little line there, blue leg there, is starting to swing through, and then you'll go back into the float phase. The picture below it is just what we call the ground reaction forces. So the forces that are dissipated through the hip, all the way through the knee, all the way to the ankle, into the toes. whenever that foot's making contact with the ground. You can break that up into two different phases, the braking phase and the acceleration phase. The braking phase is essentially when your leg is going to hit the ground, typically the heel, which is what we're going to get into later about the heel strike, causing a braking force, meaning it's stopping your momentum going forward. And then once you go into that mid stance phase, you can see in that second figure, then we'll switch over to the acceleration phase, that second and last figure, where that hip is going into an extension, meaning that it's going backwards, and the knee straightening out, going into extension, propulsing us from the ground, getting us forward. So if we go into the next slide, just some key takeaways that we want to go into the biomechanics of running. It's important to know that muscles are the most active just before and after that heel struck. You can see in the picture that me and Steve put here on the top, all the different muscles that are working synchronously to get us into that hip hike, so that hip flexion, bringing our knee up, and then extending, bringing our heel back to the ground. Lots of muscles that are involved here. So that's why it's important not just to think it's the lower extremity working like this diagram, but it's also the upper extremity, meaning the arms, shoulders, core, head, everything involved. When it comes to these words on the side, we just want to talk about how the pelvic tilt, meaning how the pelvis kind of shifts forward and backwards during our run. And it may be a little bit easier if you look on the bottom left picture to see how those hips are tilting and how the force is kind of going through the leg into the hips all the way up the kinematic chain. Kinematic chain, basically, if we go to the next slide. Good. So kinematic chain, fancy word of just saying how our body as a whole, through the musculoskeletal system, works together. So the joints, the muscles, the tissues, ligaments, tendons, all work synergistically in order to provide any movement pattern that your body and your brain want to make at that point in time. We like to think, as a runners, that it works as a locomotion system or even as just a walker. So if I'm walking, let's say, every day to the subway, my body's working as a locomotion system, not just my lower body, but also my upper body. So the hips, per se, the pelvis and the hip joints control leg movements and posture. The knees are acting as a hinge joint, both hinge joint meaning it's absorbing impact and also contributing to the push off phase, so pushing off that leg using your calf. And then the ankles and feet, what we call the distal, the farthest away from our hips, are acting as a shock absorbers. So they provide both propulsion, pushing off, and also absorption when that heel goes into the ground. So that is probably the most important part of when it comes to the kinematic chain is those ankles and the feet, spending a lot of times working with that. And then if we go into the upper body, essentially how the arms and the shoulders play a really big role in running and walking, and they're working kind of what we call reciprocally, so in opposite patterns. So if my left foot goes forward, my arm is going to go forward. If my left leg goes forward, my right arm is going to go forward, and vice versa. That way we're working in a very synergistic locomotion system, so it's ideal for running and walking. If we go to the next slide. So we want to put this in here. There's a couple articles that we, did some research in at school when we were in our gait class about Joanne Elphinstone, kind of the guru of running when it comes to using the elastic support strategy. Here at Prehab, we use the gait analysis, which is able to show us that elastic exchange between the tendon and the muscle. Essentially, there's a lot of what we call static energy built up in a tendon. And we want to use that energy that's built up in the tendon, that static energy, and transfer it smoothly and effectively into the muscle in order to, generate power and generate velocity and generate speed. If we rely so much just on muscles for that power, we can become fatigued easily. So we want to spend a lot of time on plyometrics, a lot of time on elastic exchange exercises. Going back onto Joanne Elphinstone, you can see here in the top right picture, that runner, we're not only using one part of our body at a time, but we're working in kind of this pattern where what she likes to call the transfer zones. So if I'm moving my left shoulder back, that right hip is going forward. If I'm moving my right shoulder forward, that left hip is going backwards. So that's kind of how she likes to explain how the flow of this energy is being used in different patterns throughout the body. So being able to distribute that force properly and effectively through different movement patterns will give you a lot better locomotion through running. And then here we included some pictures on the bottom, just kind of showing that elastic exchange, which I just talked about earlier, between that transferring the tendon to the muscle. Skip to the next slide. Here is something that I like to always explain to the clients and the athletes here at Prehab or just in general. That runners may complain of feeling restriction in the hamstring or the shoulders. However, when we examined, it may be found that there's limitation in the rotation of the pelvis causing the problem. So it's not projected to one area. There's multiple areas that could be affected, namely the pelvis. That usually is the root to all problems. It's not always the problem, but a lot of the times when people say, I have a tight hamstring or I have a tight hip flexor, it could be the pelvis that's not moving well. I included the picture here on the bottom. This is actually a study that was done in 2013 of a dog. So it looks a little funky. The leg here doesn't actually look like a human lower body. But the reason for this is because the dog is that they're designed very well where they're showing how the hip swings forward and back very well when it comes to their strides. If you ever see, let's say, a German Shepherd running forward, they're able to move their hips very more much more efficiently than a human being. They have a lot more range of motion. So here you can see in the first picture how their hip is tilted. I wish I had a pointer to show you guys, but if you're looking here on the left picture, Steve's actually pointing out for me. You can see that tilt of the pelvis is upwards. So there, if it's the pelvis is pointed upwards, that leg is able to swing farther forward. If the a pelvis is more neutral, I'll go back, too bad. Good. If the pelvis is more neutral or tilted more backwards, that hip or that leg is able to follow along with the mouse there. See, so that they can see it. Yeah, perfect. You can see how that leg is able to swing more back. It's it may seem complicated with this diagram, but essentially just simply the pelvis plays a big role in that angle. So if the pelvis is more forward, you're going to get a lot more swing forward. And if it's a little bit more back, you're going to get more swing back. So it may seem like it's the hamstring that's restricted on extension of the hip, but really it could just be the pelvis is not properly tilting backwards. So a lot of the times, when we work with our runners, they may benefit more from pelvic mobility exercises rather than just torquing at the hamstring or torquing at the hip flexor. Those can be worked together in combination of therapeutic exercise, but we want to make sure that we're also working on hip stabilization exercises, core exercises, and things more from the foundation of running. So if we just go to the next slide.
And to piggyback off what Justinian said, to give you guys a visual, I don't know if you ever seen like a really jacked sprinter who does like 100, 200. They're almost always dumped forward in the pelvis. Like they look like they're stuck in an anterior tilt. And they almost always say that they have tight hamstrings, but their hamstrings aren't short. They're actually pretty long, which is the orientation of the pelvis. So once we can get them to be able to move their pelvis in control instead of being stuck in that anterior tilt, they're able to generate equal or as much force, but with the pelvis in different positions, and it gives them more of a benefit. So
Exactly.
let's go to the next.
And if
So
there's
we're
any
gonna
words that we're using that you don't know, please feel free to ask, and we'll elaborate on each of those words.
yeah, me and Jay are both pretty infamous for using big words when we don't need to. So just raise your hand and we'll explain it. So I'm gonna start talking about common errors in runners. And if at any point you have any questions, just raise the hand. I think there's like an icon you can click and we'll
There is a question in the chat.
okay, let's
You want to read that question out loud, Steve, and we can try our
I'm
best.
trying to open it.
Oh, you're sharing the screen, so I'll read it. No problem.
Oh, okay. Just from your experience, I can only see half the question. Wait, oh, there, I got it. From your experience, does the restricted rotation of the pelvis cause a hamstring restriction? If left unaddressed, can the other scenario happen over time? Yeah, I think that like kind of goes into what we were saying with the sprinter. Like if the if they can't articulate their pelvis the way that they need to be able to adjust for each phase of gait. So like it should shift one way during during landing and then a different way during propulsion. If they can't, then it might cause excessive strain on the hamstring in that case. And it might just feel like it's very tight all the time where it's not actually tight. It's because the ish tubes is kind of rotated up. So did that answer your question at all a bit?
I can also like touch in on that. Sometimes maybe a bit if I'm reading this wrong. From your experience, does the restricted rotation of the pelvis cause a hamstring restriction if left unaddressed? Can the scenario happen Yeah, so when it comes to the pelvic rotation, there's two types of tilts. There's that anterior pelvic tilt where the I don't know if you guys can see my hand, where the hip is tilted forward. If the hip is tilted forward, which is typically that like sway back position that a lot of females present, it's pretty prevalent in the female population where that back is really rounded in the back or really arched, and your glutes are kind of popping up. So if that's the case, you're going to have a lot more stretched hamstrings, where it feels like they're really, really, really elongated, they're really tight. Really, it's just the hips that pelvis that's tilted so far forward. If we can kind of correct and start to engage the core, the opposite side of the back, and start to correct the core and maybe implement some more core activities and core exercises during your sessions, that way it tilt the pelvis forward into a more neutral pelvis, releasing some of the tension in the back of the hamstring. So it's not always stretch the hamstrings because that's a temporary band-aid for those hamstrings. They're just going to go back to that tautness, especially if that's kind of your innate way of like your pelvis being comfortable. So it's a lot of like training of not just the hamstring, but also the pelvis too, if that makes sense. All right, move on to the next one. Slide. All right, Steve, you can touch on that.
Cool. All right. So overstriding. So we can talk about this for a very long time, but we're going to try to simplify it and narrow it down. So basically, it would be best to look at the picture on the right. So her heel is striking in front of her center of mass. The center of mass is this dot. I don't know if you guys could see it's the little green dot right here. Ideally, when we run, we want to land as close to our center of mass as possible. So in this example, her heel is pretty far in front of her body and center of mass. It's producing a high braking force as it demonstrates here, and a lot of impact. So all that force has to go somewhere. It usually just goes in the body. A lot of times you'll see people with this pattern presenting with shin splints, heel pain, knee pain, just any pain anywhere in the chain because they're not absorbing the force as effectively as they should. This picture is actually a little bit different than we would see in the analysis. So usually when they're overstriding, it's paired with a more torso forward angle. So they're not as upright. Usually they're pretty shifted forward with the torso. Eyes are kind of looking down a little bit, and then their foot is in front of them. Usually what we see with this population is they're taking really big, long strides, trying to get ahead of themselves as much as they can at a time, and their cadence is relatively slow.
The water heater.
So
you want that? I got free.
they're not taking they're not taking as many steps as they should per minute. So they're taking really big, long strides and just landing really far in front of them. Again, we could talk about this for a very long time, but that's basically the simplest explanation of it. Usually what we see with these people, and then if you're one of them, you could raise your hand, but usually it's pretty tight hip flexors because they're not pushing the ground behind them as much as they should. They're more reaching in front of them. So it's a lot of use of those hip flexors and a lot of use of those quads, and they're not as dominant in the posterior chain, such as the glutes and the hamstrings, because they're kind of just like constantly reaching in front rather than pushing the ground behind them as we want to see in what they say is a good stride. Let's see, maybe we can go into the next, and we're going to touch more upon that in the next few slides. But as you can see here in this picture, there's a reduced knee flexion angle, so it's also called a shank angle. So there's less knee flexion, so it's more like they're just reaching out in front of a straight leg rather than lifting that knee from the core, like Justinian talked about previously. There's a little bit of a lack of reciprocity. Here, let's go down. Okay, so this is talking about a visual of how poor foot strike patterns can occur and how they can affect the rest of the mechanics. So bottom left shows someone heel striking, and it's showing a lot of force going up the chain, whereas on the right is a forefoot strike, even though the picture kind of looks like they're landing on their midfoot. Ideally, when we land on our midfoot or forefoot, it's going to allow the tendons in the calf to absorb more force. And then instead, we're in the heel strike pattern, it's just going to go straight up there and up the chain. And it doesn't really, and the heel strike pattern doesn't really allow our body to absorb the force the way that it's designed to. So it kind of it doesn't let it use that natural spring that occurs. So here you can see on the slide, one of the prehab tips to minimize overstriding is strengthening the core muscles and leg muscles, practicing drills to land more under your center of mass on the mid or forefoot. And then again, if you're like tightening those hip flexors or other muscles that are commonly seen to be tight in this population, to stretch them and ultimately come get a gait analysis so you can get it personalized for you. Let's go on to the next one. Again, more on foot strike patterns and runners. So this is breaking it down even further, the rear foot or heel strike, the midfoot or the forefoot. So you might be asking, like, how, oh, I land on my heel and I have the pain. How do I switch? Well, that's a question to come in and ask us, and we can specify for you. But it's the kind of thing that you don't really just want to change right away. So if you're like if you're used to landing on your rear foot, your heel strike, and you try, okay, I'm just going to land on my forefoot. Odds are you're still going to be landing in front of your center of mass. So you're just going to be landing on a different part of your foot, but it's not really going to change the mechanics upstream. And to further break down these patterns, the rear foot heel strike, the initial contact's happening at the heel, and then it's just going straight through. Midfoot, they're landing kind of flat foot. The initial contact's happening throughout the whole foot. And then the forefoot, the initial contact is happening solely at the ball of the foot. And then there's like little tidbits on how each one could be more beneficial. So because this presentation is mainly talking about overstriding and foot strike patterns, we're just emphasizing how overstriding is often the problem that leads to a lot of the issues. So a lot of times when runners come in, have injuries, it's usually from overstriding or most commonly from overstriding or from a hitch in the way that their gait is. So without going into all of these things, you could take a look at them if you want, but I'm not going to read every single one. Justine, do you have anything to add on the slide, or I'm good to move on?
That was good. Keep going.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to go into overpronation and underpronation. So pronation is basically the angle of your foot when it contacts the ground. So in the middle is neutral. So it's a neutral angle of the foot ankle. Supination is they're kind of landing, contacting on the outside edge of their foot. And then overpronation, they're going to contact the inside edge. So for those of you that are looking at this picture, this is a left foot. So in this all the way on the left side of this picture, their left foot's contacting on the outside of the foot, and then on the right side, it's the inside portion of that left foot. Overpronation is when the foot rolls in too much, also known as calcaneal eversion. And it's usually seen with flat or fallen arches. And then supination is the opposite, and that's usually seen with a high arch, like a very rigid, stiff foot. And that can just cause excessive strain as well, because if the foot can't change to the floor when it contacts and it's just constantly contacting with this stiff, rigid lever, it's not able to transmit force the way that it needs to. So we can move on from there, and then that could just lead to excessive. So both of them can lead to excessive stress up chain, which we would like to address if possible. Let's go. Next one. So this blurry picture kind of explains more what I was saying. So what happens when we run, our foot and ankle has to change when it contacts the ground in order to most effectively absorb force. So when we first contact the ground, the foot, I'm not gonna go over the whole biomechanics, but the rear foot makes contact essentially and then rolls to the toe in normal gait. So this is walking. This isn't going over like if you're landing on your forefoot or midfoot or anything, but you're rolling off from heel to toe. So the foot has to take shape of the ground. So your foot has to pronate. So it's not the same as overpronating. It's just your foot has a normal degree of pronation when it hits the ground, which it allows it to kind of spring and allow what we call the windlass maneuver to take effect, allow the foot to absorb the force of the ground instead of it just jamming into the ground and going upstream. This picture on the right shows excessive or like overpronation, which is when the picture above happens where'd it go? Where the ankle kind of rolls inward. All right. And then there's different angles that would be considered overpronation, but we don't have to get too far into that. Excessive vertical oscillation. We don't see it as much. Usually it's the opposite. Usually people are stuck to the ground, but excessive vertical oscillation is when they're just kind of bouncing up and down, up and down, up and down, wasting a lot of energy instead of smoothly letting their body push the ground behind them. They're kind of just pushing straight up, and it's just a lot of impact. So we're gonna go on to the next one. So poor stability. I think Justinian wanted to hop back onto this one. I think he had some notes he wanted to share.
Yeah. Do you guys hear me? Steve, you hear me?
Yeah, here.
All right, cool. Yeah, so exactly kind of like what Steve was going into with vertical oscillation. I'll just touch back on that. Vertical oscillation is a big talked about topic when it comes to runners. For a while, people thought that getting bouncier may be beneficial when it comes to running. It also depends on the type of running and the distance that you're running in. You'll see a lot of the Olympic runners when it comes to the jumps. When it comes to those, they bound and they bounce really, really high, but it's a very short distance. When it comes, you can go back a slide, Steve. But when it comes to long distance runners or just runners in general, you want to have a good median between that low vertical oscillation and the high vertical oscillation. There's a fine line between having both very, very high or high cadence. Cadence is essentially your steps per minute. And also you want to have a good balance between your high vertical displacement, meaning how much you're going upwards. Typically between 6 and 8 centimeters is the normal vertical oscillation. This can be measured by calculating the distance between the highest and the lowest points of your body during the running cycle. So essentially how far your foot is up off the ground and how low your foot is. You can do that by recording yourself, or you can get a gait analysis where you're able to kind of get those numbers out for you. when it comes to vertical oscillation too, it's important to know that you don't want to be always going upwards because that you want your momentum going forward. So you kind of have to propel yourself forward. You can switch to the next one, Steve. And like I was talking about in the beginning, a lot of the times runners will always think that it's the lower extremity, it's the legs, the hips, the calves, the feet that are doing all the work. But when it comes to just working as that one unit and being as efficient as possible, you want to have a proper core engagement, meaning that it's not just the abdominals. So people use the word core as just thinking it's the abs or the six pack that's doing the work, but there's a lot more muscles that are working in order to keep that upper extremity working. So it's a kind of that transition zone between your arms to your hips into your legs. So you want to make sure that those muscles are activated properly. So having a weak or inadequate core can lead to poor posture. With that poor posture, if I'm leaning forward because my core is shut down, that's going to lead to more forward lean and excessive trunk rotation. And then with that excessive lean, you're not going to get as much arm swing getting you backwards. So it kind of is this cascade of downfall when it comes to your body if you don't have a proper core. Our tip here, when it comes to prehab, is always strengthening the core muscles. So we're not just working the abs, but we're also working the obliques, working the oblique sling. We're also working the lower back. So those two muscles that run alongside the spine, the erector spinae muscle, we also want to work as well. And then also just things like planks, bridges, working on just transverse abdominal, meaning that muscle that kind of lies right next to the spine as well, just working and training on that, just to kind of stabilize that core. You can go to the next one, please. Perfect. So kind of just like I was talking about a second ago, if you don't have that proper core, those unnatural arm swing can come into factor as well. So a lot of the times we'll get clients, and especially the marathon runners who will come in here, worried about their arm swing because the arm swing plays a huge role when it comes to running. It's not just the legs that are doing the work, but it's also the arms that are propelling you forward. And if you have an unnatural arm swing with maybe, let's say, too much sway going forward or too little sway, or even what we call lateral movement of the arm, so that kind of that back and forth movement, it can, one, fatigue your muscles a lot easier, a lot more quicker. So let's say that all my upper extremity, and that therefore by my 22nd, 23rd, 24th mile, when I'm looking for as much energy as possible to finish out that marathon, if I'm swinging my arms constantly throughout the race, it's not going to be effective for me to finish the race. So we want to be able to train you where we're able to extend the elbow at a adequate angle as well as forward. And you can see the picture here on the left side, that 105-degree angle of that right elbow as that athlete's showing is that optimal arm extension, arm swing. You can see Steve showing there with the cursor. And then vice versa, if you go to the right side and look at the athlete there, when it comes to bending of the elbow when you're going forward, it's that about that 70-degree mark is what we're looking for the flexion of the elbow, the bend of the elbow. And that's working synergistically with the leg on the bottom, you can see on the left and then on the right. Our recommendation at prehab is keep the arms bent at that 90-degree angle. So keeping that 90-degree swing and then swing them naturally back and forth from the shoulder. And if the more you go across your body, the more energy expenditure that you're doing. And then you're not going to be able to sustain that run for, let's say, the 27 miles for the marathon. So we go to the next slide.
I just wanted to add, so obviously, like Jay said, it depends on the distance. So for a marathon, that'd probably be ideal running form, but for a sprinter or someone that's running 100 and any shorter distance, they're gonna want more aggressive arm swing and torso rotation. They're gonna probably cross midline, and it's gonna look a lot more aggressive and a lot more use of energy, but it's only a very, very, very short burst, like a minute or less. So
Yeah, exactly. It depends on the type of race that you're doing. and the distance that you're doing and the level that you're at. We always like to use the example when it comes to the short, quick strides where we're doing a quick walk. You ever see like the folks in the park that are doing the speed walking and they're just swinging their arms back and forth with the quick steps. For them, that's a very effective motion that you're going to be performing because that's going to be what you need to do in order to perform the best in that specific run. Same thing with Steve, what he was saying, if you're doing a short sprint, you're going to want to throw your arms and your legs a lot more aggressively. If you're a marathon runner and you're more of an endurance type runner, you're going to want a lot less arm swing. You're going to want a lot less leg swing, and it needs to be a lot more compact and efficient enough to last the 27 miles. So if we go to the next slide here. When it comes to the key takeaways, we want to put together all of the stuff that we were just rambling on for together into 12 facets that we want to kind of talk about. So the first one here, alignment and posture. Like we were talking about, posture is everything. There's no perfect posture. So some person may be into a slump posture. Some person may be into very erect posture, depending on what their job is, what their body makeup is, and whatnot. But it's important in order to maintain the best posture for what we're trying to do. So keeping your body aligned from head to toes will ensure efficient energy transfer and reduce that risk of injury. When it comes to two, foot strike and landing. So Steve really talked about the foot strike when it comes to overstriding, but being able to land with your foot directly under your body rather than in front of you is going to cause a lot less of that overstriding and that braking force, stopping your momentum going forward, causing any sort of reverberations up your leg, leading to injuries such as like stress fractures, tendonitis, and all that stuff that's causing pain. A midfoot strike is generally the most ideal, which you'll hear in the running, community, as it minimizes impact and promotes just a better running efficiency. And then for number 3 here, stride length and cadence. Cadence is a big buzzword in the running community, especially when it comes to marathon runners. Shortening your stride and increasing your cadence, the steps per minute again, will significantly help that stride length if you can kind of fix the cadence. A higher cadence around like 170, 180 helps improve efficiency and reduces the risk of overstriding. That 170, 180 is like kind of the foundation of what like cadence should be at, but it's not sustainable for a long period of time. So here at Prehab, when we do a gait analysis, it's usually that 170 mark being the best or the most optimal for 27 miles. And then 4, glutes, core, and hip engagement. So engaging your glutes and your hips will help stabilize your body and drive the stride forward. So like we were talking about the hips earlier, in the pelvis, it's not just the legs, the quads, the hamstrings, the calves, but it's also the hips and the glutes that are doing a lot of work when it comes to the locomotion. Arm swing, and it's a roll. So like we just talked about that last slide, we don't need to go into it, but keeping those arms bent at a 90-degree angle, working on a very effective swing where it's in synchronization with your legs. So if my left foot goes forward, my right arm's going to go forward, and then vice versa. Cadence and vertical oscillation, one of those slides earlier. So just focusing on minimizing our vertical displacement, meaning our bounce going upwards, because the more upwards we go, the more time we spend in the air and the less time we spend going forward, which is what we want to do in running. 7, proper arm and leg coordination. So kind of just talked about, we want it to be in a very natural rhythm. So we don't want it to be in a very static rhythm like a robot. We just want that arm swing to just occur naturally. Kind of like if you were to take your walking stride, nobody really thinks about when they're walking, but when you're walking form into running form. Muscle imbalances and weaknesses, so just making sure that you're strengthening the proper muscle groups at the proper days. So working in different periodization exercises throughout the week, Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, in different blocks, in order to strengthen the different muscles at the right time. So not just focusing on one area. Elastic energy and tendons. So like we talked about in the beginning with that study with Joan, making sure that the muscles and tendons are activating properly. The Achilles tendon seems to be the big one for all runners. So we're working on that stored energy and releasing that stored energy into that push-off propulsion phase. Best effects. Breathing and relaxation. So this is a big thing that we like to promote, me and Steve, when it comes to running. So having proper breathing, not using accessory muscles. So when accessory muscles, meaning like when we're hyperventilating and our sympathetic nervous system is going off and we're going in that fight or flight mode and we're panting like heavy, like, and we're doing those short breaths, we're using accessory muscles. We're using our scalenes, we're using our upper trap, we're using muscles that are not as effective as our diaphragm. So working on deep breathing through our diaphragm, through our abdomen area, will be a lot more effective than just using those accessory muscles. So working on a 3-second inhalation and a 5-second exhalation seems to be the most effective. Footwear and ground contact. So big thing with footwear. We like to talk prehab. A lot of times we'll have athletes come in with their different footwear devices and whatnot. It all depends on how and what you like. So there's no specific footwear that's going to make you into a better athlete or a faster runner. But let's say you're wearing a Brooks and you feel like it's not feeling so good, but studies say the Brook is the best shoe for long distance running. But lately you've been using a Hoka or let's say Saucony, and your running has been less painful and a lot more effective. Then let's go for the Saucony and the Hoka, maybe not so the Brooks. But we come in, if you bring us, footwear, we're all educated enough where we're able to kind of figure out what shoe fits best for your biomechanics, your anatomy, and the way that you run. And then 12, the last one, understanding the kinematic chain, like Steve talked about in the beginning, the body works as a whole unit when running. If one part is out of alignment on either side of the body, it can affect other areas, being your knees, your lower back, your neck even, or your shoulders. So we want to make sure that everything's flowing in a kinematic chain. And then there was one question that we got to from Rosa, which actually is perfect because this is exactly what I just talked about. So if there's one question I could ask, why are all my injuries on one side? I've been running for almost 7 years and all my injuries, whether they're tendonitis or stress fractures, have all been on my right leg or foot. Is this common amongst athletes and why does this happen? So long story short, when it comes to that, we do get a lot of what we call unilateral injuries when it comes to runners. Running is a very repetitive sport where you're constantly doing the same thing in a very linear pattern. When it comes to injuries, that kinematic chain comes into effect. So if let's say my ankle is the first thing to go and I have a chronic, meaning overtime ankle injury, and I hurt my ankle and I don't get that checked out, it's going to travel up the kinematic chain to, let's say, the knee. Then the knee will start hurting. And then after the knee will start hurting, it will progress into the hip. So it works in that pattern or that kinematic chain when it comes to injuries, especially when it comes to one side, if that makes sense, Rosa. And then there's one more question that I think Pat Lee asked in the chat. Let me open it up and Steve can answer this one. So Steve, I'll read you the question. What are some drills or exercises we can use to work on promoting proper stride length to prevent overstriding?
Excellent question, Pat. Our two favorites. So the first one we usually do is up against the wall. It's our patented wall drill where it's kind of hard to just talk you through it. I don't have a wall behind me, so I can't show you. But hands on the wall, kind of in a push-up position, and then focusing on lifting one leg up and then rapidly switching to the other one, focusing on trying to land directly under you on that midfoot. The other one you can employ while you're running is instead of thinking of where your foot's landing in space, just think of flexing at the knee and hip, lifting up with your core, and just picking the leg up and then letting it fall down, picking it up and letting it fall down, picking it up and letting it fall down. Usually it will just naturally land under you rather than thinking of, oh, I gotta land on this part of my foot or that part of my foot. Just try to, as soon as the leg hits the ground, lift it up and then play around with that for a little bit.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different exercises to work on that overstriding. Like Steve said, they're tough to demonstrate if we don't have a turf floor in front of us or a wall in front of us. But yeah, there's definitely a bunch of different exercises you can do to work on overstriding and getting that center of mass and that strike beneath you rather than in front of you.
We also can't tell you everything, Pat, because then no one will come in.
Yes, if you skip to the last slide, 2 slides, perfect. All right, and we want to thank you guys for joining in today over at Prehab New York City and also Prehab San Diego for tuning in as well. And come in for the next Ask Your Experts next December. Jordan will be doing a topic of discussion then. And then at any time, reach out to us via email, give us a phone call if you have any other questions, and we'll happily answer them. But thank you guys again for joining in today. We had a good time sharing this.
Thanks, guys.